Welcome to the Big Book Study podcast for anyone and everyone interested in a spiritual way of life. We are a step study which meets each week on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern and Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern. You can find our website at primarypurposebigbookstudy.com. This podcast series is a brief study of each tradition as presented in the original 12 steps and 12 traditions. AA has made the difference between misery and sobriety, and often the difference between life and death. Therefore, the AA Society of Men and Women in the beginning realized the urgent need for continuous effectiveness and permanent unity, and saw what we must work together and hang together, else most of us will finally die alone. The 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous are what beginning AAs believed the best answers that their experience had given to these very ever urgent questions. How can AA best function? And how can AA best stay whole and survive? I'm Nicole from Texas. We also have Kathleen from Colorado, Kashi from Florida, Lisa from Michigan, and Jacqueline from Washington. Today's study is on tradition 3. So I'm going to read the short form of the tradition, which is, just a moment, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And we'll go ahead and get into the reading of these first couple of paragraphs. This tradition is packed with meaning, for AA is really saying to every serious drinker, you are an AA member if you say so. You can declare yourself in, nobody can keep you out. No matter who you are, no matter how low you've gone, no matter how grave your emotional complications, even your crimes, we still can't deny you AA. We don't want to keep you out. We aren't a bit afraid you'll harm us. No, never mind how twisted or violent you may be. We just want to be sure that you get the same great chance for sobriety that we've had. So you are an AA member the minute you declare yourself. To establish this principle of membership took years of harrowing experience. In our early time, nothing seemed so fragile, so easily breakable as an AA group. Hardly an alcoholic we approached paid any attention. Most of those who did join us were like flickering candles in a windstorm. Time after time, their uncertain flames blew out and couldn't be relighted. Our unspoken constant thought was, which of us may be next? This is Nicole. I'm just going to offer a brief comment on those paragraphs that it didn't really strike me the first time through, but the second time reading those paragraphs, it really landed what a remarkable thing it is that they're saying there. And not just that they're saying, but that they're living and acting by, especially given the perspective of where we start when we come into recovery. And what it made me think of was there's an example on page 52 of the Big Book of AA. It's called the bedevilments. And they give one paragraph of what it looks like to be living in addiction without a connection to something bigger or greater than ourselves. And it says, we were having trouble with our personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of any real help to other people. And it's a common denominator, no matter what we're using as our substance, be it alcohol or sex or drugs or food or people or control or trying to get control over someone else's addictions, that we recognize ourselves in that paragraph if we have this spiritual malady. And there's an entire section in the book devoted to fear. We are gripped with fear when we get here. We are constantly trying to get control over what we think we want, what we think we need, trying not to lose what we have. We're playing God in other people's lives. We're trying to rely on ourselves to get us through a job that's way too big for us in our lives. And so we're just in this perpetual state of anxiety. So for them to say and believe and act from no matter who you are, what you've done, how grave your crimes, how severe your mental or physical state, no matter how far down the scale you've gone, you're welcome here. And not only are you welcome here, but we don't want to keep you out. And not only do we not want to keep you out, but we are a bit afraid that you will harm us. That is a remarkable statement to make and principle to live by. That sounds like freedom. And it makes you think, what does it take to get to that point to freely say something like that and live something like that? And in the paragraphs to come, they're going to get into, and I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, it's Lisa from Michigan. Just reading this tradition, it speaks directly to each person who walks through the door of a meeting that you're a member if you decide to be. And for those of us who are codependent, it struck me that we always wanted others to tell us what to do. We wanted to get approval. We wanted somebody to say, yes, this is what you should be doing, or no, you shouldn't be doing that. We will let you do this, or we won't let you do that. But here we have this refreshing statement that we get to decide as individuals, do we want to stop? That's the only requirement, is that we want to stop our addiction, our behaviors, whatever it is that is keeping us in our misery. And if the answer is yes, then we remember, and no one can disqualify us. We get to qualify ourselves, and also if we choose to walk away from the program, we have the freedom to choose. We're not contracted in any way. We're not bound by any sort of a legal agreement. We simply get to choose, and that gives us the freedom that we need, because we've been bound in this addiction, in whatever the addiction is, whether it's behavioral or substances. We've been bound by that. And now this is saying this is a free way for you. And doesn't matter what you've done. And it doesn't matter if you relapse while you're in the program. We're not going to kick you out. You're welcome here. And that's very refreshing. And with that, I'll pass.
Hi, this is Kashi in Florida. And I just want to touch on the word desire that is in the tradition, in the third tradition, which is the only requirement for AA membership, is a desire to stop drinking. And looking up this word desire, it says a strong, conscious impulse, longing, or craving for something that promises enjoyment or satisfaction. It is characterized as an intense wish or yearning. And so this intense wish or yearning to being the desire to stop drinking, or being the desire to move away from the compulsive behavior or the substance, it is that there will be enjoyment or satisfaction on the other side of that. And I wanted to touch on that word because it really encompasses this paragraph about that's the innate thing within us that brings us here to begin with, and that nobody can get in the way of that, and that we have the opportunity to get the healing that we need, and that this is an open fellowship for all who have that desire. And that is the only requirement, is to have that desire, because in that desire we are yearning, and we have an intense wish to have another way of life, to find a solution. And I will pass with that.
Thank you, Kashi. Kathleen here from Colorado. What a powerful first paragraph. So, yeah, this is the place where it's the end of the line. We've tried everything else and may not be welcome in a lot of other places. We can have been here before and left and come back, and we're welcome. We could have been here before and left and burned down our house and ran over somebody in a car and stole money violently hurt somebody, any of those things. And if we walk back in the door, we're going to hear, glad to see you. Sounds like you need to be here. This is a place that welcomes anybody, no matter what, if they're a serious drinker. They just have to have the desire to stop drinking. That is the requirement. So not anybody can just be here, but somebody that wants to stop can be here with a background like that. And you may ask, how in the world do we do that without any fear? How do we do that without worrying about disruption? How do we do that without wanting to control it? And the reason that we can do it is because we have this relationship with this higher power. And we learn in our recovery that it's that relationship that we learn the new ideals and the new attitudes that God has for us, that higher power has for us. And we know and learn over time that if we stay in those ideals in our group setting or out in the world, that we are safe and protected, that God is in charge of this group and what happens in this group. And we have a set of principles to follow, and we have a set of steps to do. And that's what we focus on. We don't focus on other people's behavior or what they've done in the past. We just focus on doing the work that we are asked to do in this relationship with our higher power. And it's very clearly lined out in the big book. And when we have our fellowship, we have lots of recovered people doing the same thing. So there is a group conscience. That is led by a higher power. And that consciousness is what keeps us safe and protected for all of us that come into these rooms. And I will pass with that.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Jacqueline. Just looking at that second paragraph, to establish this principle of membership took years of harrowing experience. There's just a lot of compassion I can feel when reading how so much of this inner debate within the group was based in fear, because so many of us come to the group absolutely white knuckling this, oftentimes what feels like a last attempt at regained sanity. And so to feel like you're risking that by opening the doors widely before you have a relationship with a higher power, I can feel into where that's coming from. And then when it's talking about how most of those who did join us were like flickering candles in a windstorm, time after time their uncertain flames blew out and couldn't be relighted. Our unspoken constant thought was which of us might be next. And again, it feels someone who's just perched on really thin ice and looking at others in comparison, rather than this really solid ground of centeredness and connection with something greater than self. And so to come to this group consciousness that's all based on everyone has their relationship with higher power, and collectively the group holds that kind of neutrality and openness and welcoming to others coming in and coming out as they might, is a huge evolution, and one that I think would be a challenge to reach just from thinking about it versus getting really quiet and feeling into with that greater connection.
This is Kashi in Florida, bottom of page 139. A member gives us a vivid glimpse of those days. At one time, he says, every AA group had many membership rules. Everybody was scared, witless, that something or somebody would capsize the boat and dump us all back into the drink. Our foundation also asked each group to send in its list of protected regulations. The total list was a mile long. If all those rules had been in effect everywhere, nobody could have possibly joined AA at all. So great was the sum of our anxiety and fear. We were resolved to admit nobody to AA, but that hypothetical class of people we termed pure alcoholics, except for their guzzling and the unfortunate results thereof, they could have no other complications. So beggars, tramps, asylum inmates, prisoners, queers, plain crackpots, and fallen women were definitely out. Yes, sir. We'd cater only to pure and respectable alcoholics. Any others would surely destroy us. Besides, if we took in those odd ones, what would decent people say about us? We built a fine mesh fence right around AA.
Thanks, Thanks, Kashi. This is Nicole. Yeah, just looking at these paragraphs, it's one thing to look back at all of this, but thinking about when all of this began, it was all brand new. There weren't people that came before. They didn't have these traditions. They didn't know how it would all work out, and they were living in a very different time. So there wasn't much understood about alcoholism, and there was more misunderstood about alcoholism. It was thought of as an issue or problem of morality, or alcoholism was thought of as a weakness of character or judgment. It wasn't understood as an illness the way that it is today. And oftentimes there was a sole provider in a home, so there weren't many options of working it out another way. So someone finding out that you were an alcoholic, or working with someone who was an alcoholic, who was a criminal or in an asylum or on the fringes of society, it could have cost them their homes or their jobs or their families or their standing in their communities. So the stakes were high. And they really give us a lot of helpful insight into their experience, that this didn't happen overnight. Even though they had recovered from alcoholism, it's not like they immediately knew how to put this into practice. When faced with this difficulty, they were full of fear. They didn't know what to do. And they tried to rely on themselves, which is what we do. We try to use human solutions to combat those fears and guard against what we fear. And we all have this same root trouble, selfishness and self-centeredness. No matter what our addictions are, we're worried about how something might affect us. And the more we fight to have our own way or to get control, the worse matters get. We start with one rule and we're people who can't quit or stop. So before we know it, the list is a mile long. And before we know it, our lives become unmanageable. So this is a beautiful example of what it is when they say what we turn to is giving rather than getting. And this is an example of living in get, of getting for ourselves, worried about ourselves. And what they arrive at in the tradition is giving. The reason that they're there is so that someone can have the same great chance at recovery as they had. And when we shift to give, it's like that fear lifts immediately. We don't have to solve the fear problem. We just have to turn to give, and the problem's removed. And I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, it's Lisa. So in the reflection there, we see a lot of our character defects as addicts, codependents, alcoholics, sex and love addicts, gamblers. It doesn't matter what we use. We have these same character defects like selfishness, where we make what other people do about us. If other people are coming in, do they reflect upon me because they're different than I am? And so we see also our fear. We're trying to run the show. We're afraid something is going to disturb. We finally found something that worked. And so it's a natural human reaction to be afraid of losing that. But what they found out was that all these rules weren't going to keep things running. We would just keep having more and more rules upon rules and rules for the rules. And so we had to go back to tradition one and remembering that personal recovery depends upon unity. The list of rules isn't going to keep us united, but what will is this concept of working shoulder to shoulder with each other, with higher power, and remembering that we're all really the same. It's not us here in this group versus them out in the world living their life. It's not this Alcoholics Anonymous meeting versus this Al-Anon group. We're all really the same. And we have these weekly meetings that are for all on Wednesdays and Sunday on our website. And the reason we do that is the big book tells us to set aside a night a week to do that. And it helps us to really see that we're all having the same spiritual malady, that this is the root of our troubles. And it's not specific to any kind of labeling that we might put on things. We like to do that. Our brains like to label things to make it easier to understand. But the reality is that we're all the same. And if we kept out certain groups of people, we would be losing out on all kinds of a plethora of help that we can get from each other. It's often from the various and diverse backgrounds and viewpoints and experiences that we can come to see the reality of our own disease. And that's part of the beauty of the fellowship. And with that, I'll pass.
Maybe you think we old timers were pretty intolerant. I can tell you, there was nothing funny about us then. We were grim because we felt our lives and homes were threatened. And that was no laughing matter. Intolerant, you say? We were frightened. Naturally, we began to act like most everybody does when afraid. After all, isn't fear the true basis of intolerance? Yes, we were intolerant.
This is Kathleen. I'll go ahead and comment. Yeah, the fear thing is real. And this is what they're doing here is they're telling us about how they came to this truth, this tradition, and the truth of we don't deny anybody. And what's happening is they're terrified that they'll lose what they have. You know, for many of us out in the world, have found ourselves in many situations before recovery where we're involved in a group of some kind, whether it's at work or church or a friendship group or whatever, and a family. And we end up and they don't have the traditions yet. They don't have these guidelines that say, if you do it like this, it'll actually work. And they're learning about this idea that we can accept anybody that's here. And the reason that we can do that, and we can do that well now, is because we have traditions. We have these guidelines and of how our groups are based on them, and they're run with them as the foundation. And so that's what keeps the group together, not us and our opinions about other people, not us and our perceptions about other people and what they will do to the group. Or yeah, the whole judgment thing is above our pay grade. We have these traditions and this step work. That's what we have. That's what we focus on. And yeah, they're just learning here about how important it is to work with and let those come in of all sorts. And it doesn't matter what our background is. And fear is what creates intolerance. I love that idea. This is something that is so fundamentally basic for us, and yet we forget it all the time. But it is truly, when we go into a fearful state, that is when we're intolerant. We try to control, we get very narrow. Things get very narrow where you're either in or you're out, or things get very black and white. And somehow we think that's going to keep us safe. But the opposite is true. And the opposite of that is this higher power that is loving and benevolent and all powerful to keep these groups safe and protected. And we turn that fear over to our higher power. We do over and over again in recovery. Fear is, the big book talks about how it's the thread through everything. So and it will be the beginning of our discontented state, which leads to the drink. And we learn that we have to be very careful about that. And they're getting a really good lesson about this, and they figured it out, which is amazing.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Jacqueline from Washington. So in that latter paragraph, it talks about how maybe this sounds comical, but there was nothing funny about this situation at the time. And again, that's because they're feeling like as they put it, their home is threatened. If they're letting people in, like, it could just fall into shambles. However, when reading that line, it is hard not to chuckle. The "yes, sir, we'd cater only to pure and respectable alcoholics." And the reason, at least that strikes my funny bone, is that I think any one of us in our ick, in our form of disease, as we do our 10th steps, we can identify that there's selfishness, that we're dishonest, fearful, inconsiderate, and that those things keep cropping up in our lives, no matter what our external circumstances may look like. It's throwing all these various external identifiers of beggars or fallen women, prisoners, etc. And in recovery, we quickly realize that it genuinely does not matter what our external circumstances might be, that internally we both, like any one of us, came crawling hands and knees, kind of white knuckling this solution when we needed it the most. Anyway, I just wanted to comment that. Thanks.
Okay, Kathleen here. I'm going to keep us reading. How could we then guess that all those fears were to prove groundless? How could we know that thousands of these sometimes frightening people were to make astonishing recoveries and become our greatest workers and intimate friends? Was it incredible that AA was to have a divorce rate far lower than average? Could we then foresee that troublesome people were to become our principal teachers of patience and tolerance? Could any then imagine a society which would include every conceivable kind of character and cut across every barrier of race, creed, politics, and language with ease? Why did AA finally drop all its membership regulations? Why did we leave it to each newcomer to decide himself whether he was an alcoholic and whether he should join us? Why did we dare to say, contrary to the experience of society and government everywhere, that we would neither punish nor deprive any AA of membership, that we must never compel anyone to pay anything, believe anything, or conform to anything? The answer, now seen in Tradition 3, was explicitly itself. At last, experience taught us that to take away any alcoholic's full chance was sometimes to pronounce his death sentence, and often to condemn him to endless misery. Who dared to be the judge, jury, and executioner of his own sick brother? I think these questions are really important because it's basically giving lots of principles of AA, and we're looking at not excluding anybody and allowing anybody to be here if they have a desire to stop drinking or whatever it is that they do that is their insanity. You can really, that these questions are really opening up how we exclude people, right? You have to, if they're saying basically race, creed, politics, language, nothing, money, how much you pay to be here, how troublesome you are. It just gives a very clear indication of the different ways that they could exclude people. And then talking about how when we do include people, what they end up bringing, and that we are not, at the end of the day, we don't get to be the judge and jury. and how important it is that our brothers and sisters that come in here just as they are, if they can't be here, again, I said this earlier, this is the last stop. So if we don't, we've tried everything else. And a lot of times if we go back out on the streets, we may end up dead. So we're looking at all the possible ways that we could include people or exclude them if we chose to. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Kashi in Florida. And these paragraphs brings me to, it's while we were reading the paragraph, it's okay, hence they whittled it down to the only requirement being a desire. That's a lot of whittling down that they were able to do. And it's so important that they emphasize here how this is a self-diagnosed situation. And then, so that brings me to page 44 in the big book, where, you know, those who have come before us give us the opportunity to self-diagnosis. How can we self-diagnose ourselves? How can we get educated what it is that we're dealing with? And so there's some questions here on page 44 that help the person who's new to become qualified, to help them understand whether they really do belong here or not, and to ask themselves the questions to determine for themselves. And on page 44, it says, in the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. And so these are the chapters more about alcoholism, and there's a solution and Bill's story, and they're educating us about what alcoholism looks like, what it is, somebody else's experience with it. It says, we hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. And so here's some questions to offer people who are new to help them self-diagnose. If when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking, or fill in the blank, you have little control over the amount you take, you're probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience will conquer. And so from offering a newcomer these questions to help them assess for themselves whether they belong here or not, we can help people help themselves to determine that they do have this desire or they don't have this desire. This is them or this is not them.
Thanks, Kashi. This is Nicole. There seems to be a couple of ideas here that in God's hands or in love's hands, that being faced with these fears was really an opportunity. Instead of a problem, it's an opportunity for them to grow towards a higher power and growing away from thinking about themselves and how they might be affected to growing towards thinking about somebody else and really opening up to the idea and considering that someone else might be condemned to misery or death, and that becoming more important or more central than what was going to happen to them. And as we shift from thinking about ourselves to thinking about others, that fear begins to lift. And then in the first part of this paragraph, how some of these frightening people were to make astonishing recoveries and become our greatest workers and intimate friends, that in God's hands, that our painful past can be used to benefit others. So it says in the big book, in the family afterwards, in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, this painful past may be of infinite value to other families struggling with their problems. And in God's hands, the dark past is the greatest possession you have, the key to life and happiness for others. So in higher power's hands, that our experiences, no matter how grave or how complicated, can be used to benefit others. Those of us who have this spiritual malady are in this perpetual loop when we get here, that we are alone in our lives and in our problems. And often it's a turning point of hope when we hear someone speak about the problem and that they found a solution. The relief that comes when it dawns on us that this is something that we share, that we're not alone, that maybe we have this addiction and that maybe we have this spiritual malady. And if they could find hope and help here, that we might be able to as well. So they're not hiding around their past and their problems, they're being visible, and that those things can be used in God's hands to help others. And I'll pass.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, it's Lisa. Yeah, so in this tradition, in this reading, we hear, who dared to be judge, jury, and executioner of his own sick brother? Before program, we were definitely living in a lot of judgment and a lot of compare and compete. And it's only through finding the program, working the steps, and by the grace of God that we have found this solution. We're not better than or less than anyone else. So we might have some experience in the program, some time in the program. We've worked all the steps. And so we have the knowledge of that. And the people coming in don't. And that's the difference. It's not that we're better than them. So we don't have any right to judge, but we do have a duty to offer the solution to the newcomer. This idea that we've been there and that we now can offer hope because we've found this solution. And we are able to see defects in our brothers and sisters because we have those defects ourselves. But again, it doesn't matter our time in the program, whatever we have, we're not any better or any worse than the next addict. And that goes for those who have the same addiction as us and those who have different addictions. We're not, for example, as co-addicts, codependents, for example, that we're not better than an alcoholic. We don't somehow say, I don't do that, I'm somehow better. We're all having the same issue, the same problem, and we can unify around that. We can also unify around the solution, which is the ultimate goal. But somebody coming into the program needs the opportunity to express themselves and where they're at. And if we can listen and be that person who sees and hears the other addict and recognize we've been there too, sponsorship, we're able to share a little bit of that in the beginning so that the newcomer can see that we too were there, but now we have hope and a better way of life through working these steps. And that's how the program works. So if we were to keep everybody out, to meet some criteria to come in, I don't think any of us would be here. And so that's why it needs to remain open, that you have the desire to stop. That's the only requirement. And if we really have the desire and we're willing to do anything to get better, we will work this program and we will find the hope and the serenity and the joy in life that we've been looking for all along. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Jacqueline. I'll go ahead and continue reading. As group after group saw these possibilities, they finally abandoned all membership regulations. One dramatic experience after another clinched this determination until it became our universal tradition. Here are 2 examples. On the AA calendar, it was year 2. In that time, nothing could be seen but 2 struggling, nameless groups of alcoholics trying to hold their faces up to the light. A newcomer appeared at one of these groups, knocked on the door, and asked to be let in. He talked frankly with that group's oldest member. He soon proved that his was a desperate case, and that above all, he wanted to get well. But he asked, "Will you let me join your group? Since I am the victim of another addiction, even worse stigmatized than alcoholism, you may not want me among you. Or will you?" There was the dilemma. What should the group do? The oldest member summoned 2 others and in confidence laid the explosive facts in their laps. What about it? If we turn this man away, he'll soon die. If we allow him in, only God knows what trouble he'll brew. What shall the answer be, yes or no? At first, the elders could look only at the objections. We deal, they said, with alcoholics only. Shouldn't we sacrifice this one for the sake of the many? So went the discussion while the newcomer's fate hung in the balance. Then one of the three spoke in a very different voice. What we are really afraid of, he said, is our reputation. We are much more afraid of what people might say than the trouble this strange alcoholic might bring. As we've been talking, 5 short words have been running through my mind. Something keeps repeating to me, what would the master do? Not another word was said. What more indeed could be said? Overjoyed, the newcomer plunged into 12th step work. Tirelessly, he laid AA's message before scores of people. Since this was a very early group, those scores have since multiplied themselves into thousands. Never did he trouble anyone with his other difficulty. AA had taken its first step in the formation of Tradition 3. This is a super powerful example to set in concrete what we've been discussing so far as the evolution into Tradition 3. And again, it's not without compassion. I can certainly imagine myself why, when you're white knuckling this relatively new solution, 1 as an individual and 2 with a group of similarly newly recovered individuals, that you're not, it's shaky territory. It would be shaky territory. But there's that connection to God. There's that connection to higher power and that stillness and that neutrality where fear was peeking its head in some of those 3 members as they collected. Fear came first and foremost. And then there was a stillness. And the way that this is written very much feels like higher power communicated through this other person when saying, what would the master do? Those are just other forms of control. And so as we're learning about how this group was navigating, they're playing with those parameters. They're playing with those attempts of control. And there was a silent truth that kind of spoke through one of the members. And that stillness and that neutrality spoke really clearly for the group. And I think that when, again, it talks about, the line is, the answer now seen in Tradition 3 was simplicity itself on page 141 that we just read. And there it is. It's the most simple answer forward is, rather than having a list of parameters and regulations a mile long, as was alluded before, to drop all of that and to simplify it to just this one thing that any individual can determine for themselves, that no one else is making that determination for them. And that's the desire to stop drinking, or that's the desire to stop engaging in whatever our addictive form of insanity might be.
Thank you, Jacqueline. This is Kathleen. What we are really afraid of is our reputation. Where are we going to place our faith? Where is our higher power? Who is our higher power? Because in this situation, this member of the group pointed out, and they all realized that's what they were most worried about. And how often is that the first filter that comes in, especially for us addicts and codependents? Before our first thought is not, what would higher power do? Or what would higher power want? Our first thought is, in a tenth of a second, what are other people going to think? How is this going to appear? How is this going to look to others in the group, others outside the group? Are members of the group going to leave because of this? Are people not going to come in because of this? And there we are trying to run the show again. Great realization right here, something that we all must have in our process of recovery. And for many of us, we must have it over and over and over again. It's such a insidious filter that we put on and what this person is saying here is, what would the master do? So what would higher power do in this situation? What would love do in this situation? And it becomes very clear, and that's going to be much different than what we imagine humans are going to think and say about what we do. Often what members think other humans think we're going to say or do are not what we think it's going to be. But nonetheless, we worry about that and we make all kinds of really important decisions based on that, which end up being a problem. And this was a moment where this tradition came forward, and it's the moment when I would add, meaning that that AA now could last as long as it has lasted because of this realization right here in these paragraphs.
Thanks, Kathleen. This is Nicole. Yeah, in these sections, it comes full circle. So they've been discussing about how they were concerned about letting people in who were not, quote, pure. But then they demonstrate how this works. They're applying the steps, the spiritual principles to this problem. And they are visible around their distorted thinking, their fears, their selfishness and self-centeredness. And they're also demonstrating their willingness to look honestly at themselves and their own motives and their own behaviors. And they got down to the root of their trouble, which was what we're really afraid of is ourselves, our reputation. And once we come with a willingness to look honestly, then that opens the door to our higher power. And it gets us hooked back up to, instead of ourselves and thinking about ourselves, then the door opens to what would be helpful to others, what would be of service. And when we're hooked up to our higher power, the answer is clear as a bell. We know it when we've landed there. And this is transformative, what they're doing here. And they knew if they wanted to live happy, joyous, and free, they were going to have to learn how to live and rely on a higher power by taking the actions to rely on a higher power and to open the door to all. Anyway, I'll pass there.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, it's Lisa. Yeah, going back to the phrase, what would the master do? Referring to higher power, as we know, the capitalization in the big book and in the 12 and 12 refers to higher power. So God, higher power doesn't exclude. We all come in with this same spiritual malady. Some drink about it, some gamble about it, some act out codependently. We have different behaviors, but we're all been trying to get something on the outside to make us feel better on the inside. And the truth is that if we only surrender part of our life, the result will be nil. We won't get the help that we need. We have to surrender all of our lives. So we give all to God. We all come in with, most of us come in with a dominant addiction, a dominant problem, but there are other things that we're also doing underneath that. And we have to give our whole life to God. And so this person in the story who had the other problem, which isn't explained what it is, which I think is also higher power speaking, because we all have these other things in our life. Big Book tells us that when we do this work and we straighten out physically, we're also going to straighten out mentally, emotionally, and we're going to find that we are transformed. So we give everything to God. And this tradition really was higher power inspired to make sure that we are welcoming to everyone who has the desire to quit, because we are in no state to make rules and guide and boundaries around this person can come in, this person can't. We all have a number of different issues going on when we come into the program, because that's the way that a disease works. It impacts us physically, mentally, emotionally, in all these ways. And likewise, the solution that's in the 12-step can impact us in all those ways. And we can find that we can have a transformation in all those areas if we give all those over to higher power. And with that, I'll pass. And I'll go ahead and conclude the reading on tradition 3. Not long after the man with the double stigma knocked for admission, AA's other group received into its membership a salesman we shall call Ed. A power driver, this one, and brash as any salesman could possibly be. He had at least an idea a minute on how to improve AA. These ideas he sold to fellow members with the same burning enthusiasm which he distributed automobile polish, but he had one idea that wasn't so saleable. Ed was an atheist. His pet obsession was that AA could get along better without its God's nonsense. He browbeat everybody, and everybody expected that he'd soon get drunk, for at the time he was on the pious side. There must be a heavy penalty, it was thought, for blasphemy. Distressingly enough, Ed proceeded to stay sober. At length, the time came for him to speak in a meeting. We shivered, for we knew what was coming. He paid a fine tribute to the fellowship. He told how his family had been reunited. He extolled the virtue of honesty. He recalled the joys of 12-step work. And then he lowered the boom. Cried Ed, I can't stand this God stuff. It's a lot of malarkey for weak folks. This group doesn't need it, and I won't have it. To hell with it. A great wave of outraged resentment engulfed the meeting, sweeping every member to a single resolve. Out he goes. The elders led Ed aside. They said firmly, you can't talk like this around here. You have to quit or get out. With great sarcasm, Ed came back at them. Now do tell, is that so? He reached over to a bookshelf and took up a sheaf of papers. On top lay the foreword to the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Then, under preparation, he read aloud, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. Relentlessly, Ed went on. When you guys wrote that sentence, did you mean it or didn't you? Dismayed, the elders looked at one another, for they knew he had them cold. So Ed stayed. Ed not only stayed, he stayed sober, month after month. The longer he kept dry, the louder he talked against God. The group was in anguish so deep that all fraternal charity had vanished. When, oh when, groaned members to one another, will that guy get drunk? Quite a while later, Ed got a sales job, which took him out of town. At the end of a few days, the news came in. He'd sent a telegram for money, and everybody knew what that meant. Then he got on the phone. In those days, we'd go anywhere in a 12-step job, no matter how unpromising. But this time, nobody stirred. Leave him alone. Let him try it by himself for once. Maybe he'll learn a lesson. About 2 weeks later, Ed stole by night into an AA member's house and, unknown to the family, went to bed. Daylight found the master of the house and another friend drinking their morning coffee. A noise was heard on the stairs. To their consternation, Ed appeared. A quizzical smile on his lips, he said, have you fellows had your morning meditation? They quickly sensed that he was quite in earnest. In fragments, his story came out. In a neighboring state, Ed had holed up in a cheap hotel. After all his pleas for help had been rebuffed, these words rang in his fevered mind. They have deserted me. I've been deserted by my own kind. This is the end. Nothing is left. As he tossed on his bed, his hand brushed the bureau nearby, touching a book. Opening the book, he read. It was a Gideon Bible. Ed never confided any more of what he saw and felt in that hotel room. It was the year 1938. He hasn't had a drink since. Nowadays, when old-timers who know Ed foregather, they exclaim, what if we had actually succeeded in throwing Ed out for blasphemy? What would have happened to him and all the others he later helped? So, the hand of Providence, early, gave us a sign that any alcoholic is a member of our society when he says so. I'll offer a couple of short comments here. Yeah, so we see that the hand of Providence is referring to higher power, again, giving us a sign. And so even if we don't believe in that's higher power, that doesn't stop us from being a member. As Ed pointed out at this time, it's the manuscript for the big book. It's not even published yet, is where it says the only requirement for AA membership is the desire to stop drinking. So this is where this tradition pulls directly from this. So from the beginning, this idea was laid down, the hand of God working in this idea, in this tradition. Had they thrown Ed out, so many would not have been helped. And many come in with no belief in a higher power, and a lot of times no desire for belief in a higher power. So if that was a requirement, you couldn't be a member if you didn't believe or want to believe, then there would be so many people who would not be helped, and all the people that those people helped would not be helped. And we can see how higher power has been working through our fellowship, not only through individuals, but in the whole fellowship as a whole. And so we trust the ultimate authority in our groups, which is a loving higher power. And we don't concern ourselves with who should or shouldn't enjoy the group. That's above our pay grade. We leave it all up to higher power to sort out who will be members and who will not. And with that, I'll pass.
Thanks, Lisa. This is Nicole. I love Ed. He just makes me laugh. And what an amazing story that it brings to mind step 2, that came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It doesn't say we believe, it says they came to believe. And they shared what they arrived at in this tradition was a result of experience. And this is an example of the principle came first. They didn't have the belief first. What they did have was that they were convinced that the way of life that they had been living didn't work, that it had failed them entirely. And what we want is evidence before we're willing to let go of control. We want proof first that it's all going to work out, or we want proof first, and then the experiences will come to reveal that we're right. But what they did here is in sharing that Ed says, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking, and you have to live by that principle. They didn't want to do it, but they knew that their way of living wasn't working. And so they took the action based on the principle, and then the belief followed. They saw that it worked. They saw that when they surrendered to the spiritual principle, that in God's hands was so much greater than anything that could have happened in their hands. And in fact, in their hands, all of these people that Ed ended up helping might not have been helped if they had gotten their way. And in the chapter Working with Others in the Big Book of AA, it says, when we look back, we realize that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. And that this is such a beautiful example of that idea at work. They took the action, and then they came to believe, and then they came to rely upon it. This is Nicole. If there are no other comments, we'll go ahead and read the long form of this tradition 3. Our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism. Hence, we may refuse none who wish to recover. Nor ought AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that, as a group, they have no other affiliation. And that is on page 563 of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Thank you for joining us today. Our next podcast will be on Tradition 4. You can find our meetings at primarypurposebigbookstudy.com. We meet each week on Sundays at 2 p.m. Eastern and Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern. Join us on the road of happy destiny. Thank you, everyone, for your service.